Good evening, everybody. So, tonight, today we're going to be finishing up with the reproductive system of the female. Right, last week, we got through urinary, we got into the male reproductive system. Right, we looked at the gonads, the different portions of the urethra, right, the spongy urethra. We looked at the prostate, the seminal vesicle, etc. Right, we worked our way into the female reproductive tract. We'd gotten through looking at the different parts of the uterus and the different parts of the ovary. We had gotten into looking at the different epitheliums which line the fallopian tube. Here's where we're going to start to take a little bit deeper of a look into the structure and the anatomy of the fallopian tubes, as well as those processes which are involved with fertilization and implantation, right? Because that, in a nutshell, is the entire purpose to all of this. There is hormone production, right, through the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. There is the production of estrogen. There is the production of progesterone. But by and large, the reason why that occurs is to ready the body for potentially implantation. So as that occurs, right, we had kind of covered some of this last week. As the oocyte and the sperm meet up, as they meet up, the sperm penetrates the oocyte, and when they combine, they form something called a zygote. Cool. That zygote then becomes something that's around 4 cells in size. That's just day 2. So in day 1, it went from 2 separate cells to 1 particular cell. And then it went from 1 to 2 to 4 in 2 days. The following day, it divides again. At this point, when it's a marula, it's around 16 cells in size. Something about the blackberry. Now, these steps here, blastocyst, here, at this point, this is when the fertilized embryo, that fertilized egg, that's when it is ready to penetrate, right? Penetrate the uterine wall and implant. Like I had mentioned last class. When I had mentioned last class, fertilization has to occur somewhere right here. It can't occur here. If it does occur here, it takes around 7 or so days in order for the zygote. It has to go from here, and it has to travel this entire distance in order to be ready to implant. Let's just imagine, if fertilization did not occur here, but if it occurred here, well, 7 days later, 7 days later, it'd already be, down through the cervix. So fertilization has to occur somewhere here, in that first part of the uterine tube. That's where it's going to occur if you want it to be a successful fertilization. Now, talking about successful fertilization, this is where we look at all of the different hormones in conjunction with the maturity of the follicle, in conjunction with the thickness of the uterine wall. Right? Think of it for a minute. The ovary, within the ovary, that process of maturing the egg is going to occur. That occurs, so therefore, if the egg becomes fertilized, The idea is that it will implant into the uterine wall. Now, the uterine wall can only be implanted into if it has been appropriately prepared. This is the importance of the different hormones. And these hormones come from the follicles. So, gonadotropin releasing hormone, released from the hypothalamus, stimulates the release of LH or FSH as well as LH. Cool. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates the follicles to mature, to mature, to mature. As that happens, you can see the size of these follicles. It goes from this, a little bigger, even bigger, and then really big. As they develop more and more so, right, the primordial follicles, they pump out a little bit of estrogen. As they develop, as these follicles get bigger and bigger and bigger, they pump out more and more and more estrogen. And we can see what that causes is that actually causes the wall of the uterus to thicken. So let's just imagine hypothetically if we didn't have the release of estrogen. Again, hypothetically, if we didn't have the release of estrogen, we wouldn't have the release, or we wouldn't have the proliferation of the endometrium or the thickness of the wall of the uterus, and it would just be kind of flat like this. You wouldn't see it thicken like this. But fortunately, because of the production of FSH, that in turn stimulates the follicles to mature. As the follicles mature, they then release estrogen. That estrogen then causes the uterine wall, or the endometrium, to thicken. Alright. One of the things to remember is that inside of the follicle is the oocyte. That is the egg. Eventually, once that egg gets mature, once it matures, well, now it's time to be flushed. Alright, so what does that mean? That means ovulation, right? Once it's flushed out of the toilet, once it's flushed down the drain, it's flushed out of the ovary, right? That is ovulation. That is caused by luteinizing hormone. Right? 'Cause what happens? I'm just going to draw a random line. Let's say this line here, that's the line that has to be reached in order for luteinizing hormone to be stimulated, to be released from the anterior pituitary. So here at the primordial follicles, right? Primordial follicles, let's say that's right here. Estrogen levels are quite low. Quite low. They're increasing a little bit. Now let's go to the level of the primary follicles. Alright, so FSH had been released. The follicles are beginning to mature a little bit more so. Right. I mean, really, at the level of the primordial follicles, and the primordial follicles really aren't producing much estrogen whatsoever. Right? Same thing with the primary follicles. They do start to begin to produce some. But really, once we get to the level of primary to secondary, secondary to mature, that's where we begin to start to release large amounts of estrogen. So right around day 13, right, of the ovarian cycle, that's when estrogen levels get high enough. Oh, I've crossed the threshold, I've crossed the line, meaning luteinizing hormone is now released, and that causes ovulation. This doesn't, this doesn't occur immediately, it takes around 24 hours for this to have an impact. Meaning, let's just imagine you ovulate on day 14. That means that on day 13, that's when you would have had that estrogen spike, right? That's when you would have actually had the release of luteinizing hormone. All right. So once the oocyte, once it's been ovulated, right? There's this empty follicle, if you want to call it that, this empty follicle, right? That's what this is right here. The empty follicle is now something called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum. Seemingly it wouldn't be of any importance, but oh, yes it is. Absolutely. It is equally as important. Right? Just as where the follicle functioned in the maturation of the oocyte, the corpus luteum functions to help maintain that oocyte indirectly. When I say indirectly, yeah, what happens? The estrogens from the follicles thicken the endometrial wall. Cool. Once the oocyte is ovulated, now we have the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum begins to pump out large amounts of progesterone. Progesterone functions to maintain the endometrial wall. Right? It maintains the endometrial wall, and the endometrium itself begins to produce a variety of secretions. Different endometrial glands begin to develop, right, to produce different secretions for the potentially implanted egg, right, or implanted blastocyst. If that doesn't happen, progesterone levels elevate. Now the endometrial wall stays sustained. But what happens if no implantation occurs? Well, the endometrial wall sheds and menstruation occurs. Well, what's the gist? What actually occurs here? Why might this not happen? Let's say if mom is, let's say in the uterus, let's say an egg were to, right, or a blastocyst were to actually implant here. Think of it as being like the very primitive placenta, something called the chorion, the chorionic sac. This is like the very primitive placenta. This is going to begin to secrete a hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. If you have ever taken a pregnancy test, this is the hormone which those tests are testing for. This hormone is going to cause the corpus luteum to continue pumping out progesterone. So, if implantation doesn't occur, that means we don't produce HCG. If we don't produce HCG, the corpus luteum eventually breaks down, it degrades, and it stops pumping out progesterone. When it stops pumping out progesterone, that's when the endometrial wall sheds and menstruation occurs. Right? Menstruation, that is literally the innermost lining of the uterus shedding off. Right? Don't worry, luckily you're in luck. Right? Women, they're born, ballpark figure, 400,000 oocytes. Right? By no stretch of the imagination will you come even close to maturing that many. Right? But you're born with right around 400,000. But one thing we can see is that once menstruation occurs, the next step, the next round of ovarian cycle and uterine cycle begins. The primary follicles, as it develops, begin to pump out estrogen. The reason they developed was because FSH was produced, which causes, again, the maturation of the follicle. As the follicles mature, they pump out more and more estrogen, which proliferates and thickens the endometrial wall. Eventually, there's that estrogen spike, which stimulates the luteinizing hormone, which causes ovulation. That empty follicle, or the corpus luteum, begins to pump out progesterone. If there's implantation, HCG begins to be released. If there's no implantation, HCG is not released, and menstruation occurs. All right. And then corpus albicans, that's literally just the corpus luteum when it breaks down and like degrades. It breaks down into the corpus albicans, which doesn't do anything. It's just a remnant, right? It doesn't do anything. One of the things with the corpus luteum, we'll look at these hormones in just a second. But one thing with the corpus luteum in pregnancy, right? The corpus luteum, this is the structure which is going to pump out sufficient levels of estrogen for the pregnancy to sustain itself for right around the first 3 months. Right? At that time, that's when the placenta begins to produce sufficient levels of hormones completely on its own. Right? That's why, like, if you've ever had or known somebody, right, 12 weeks is kind of like the kind of sigh of relief, right? For some reason, there's just at 12 weeks you just kind of get this, all right, you just feel a little bit more at ease about the pregnancy. And part of the reason why that is because now the placenta is essentially self-sustaining, right? It's producing all the hormones, well, for the most part, producing the hormones and it's producing the hormones that it needs in order to sustain itself. Prior to that, the corpus luteum, let's imagine if I were to look at an ovary, right? After, in pregnancy, the corpus luteum grows immensely large. I mean, I'm talking, it might even be like half the size of the ovary. Immensely sized. And the reason why that happens is because it has to pump out sufficient levels of progesterone. Why? Well, remember, progesterone is what causes the uterine wall to stay thickened. If at any time that sheds off, or assuming if at any time progesterone drops, this wall sheds. Your house, does not matter how big your house is. If I take the ground beneath it and I slide it off a cliff, guess what's going with it? The house. Right, so we have to have a way to anchor that layer to, right, the endometrium. There's layers called the bacillus, the decidua. We'll talk about those. You'll talk about those in lecture. But there's got to be a way to maintain this layer throughout the duration of pregnancy. And this is just, again, a graphic on the hormones throughout the uterine and the ovarian cycle. Right. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. You can see how it never really elevates to any extent. I mean, really, it doesn't get much higher than this, right? The entire time, even when it's stimulating follicles, it never really elevates to any appreciable extent. Way different than estrogen. Way different than luteinizing hormone. Way different than progesterone. They all substantially increase. FSH never really does. It just kind of has these little knolls. But you can see, right around day, 2, 3, we get this big release of FSH, which gets the ball rolling and gets those follicles developing. as those follicles develop, that's what slowly begins to produce the estrogen. And when they're right around day 12, day 13, that's where estrogen hits that threshold, which causes the release of LH. Because remember, LH is what's going to cause ovulation. Awesome. When it releases ovulation, or when the ovulation occurs, right, luteinizing hormone, again, isn't going to tank. But one thing we see is the elevation of progesterone. Now, here, just looking at this graph, oh, did this person get pregnant or did they have implantation? No. How do I know that? Because I saw progesterone go down. If I were to, for instance, see progesterone, right, do one of these things where it kind of continues to elevate, that's when we know, ooh, progesterone levels are elevating. They're not dropping off. Well, this person must be pregnant. Just a graphic of the actual release of, or the ovulation, right? The release of that mature oocyte. You can see high levels of estrogens from the mature follicle stimulate the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and LH. Well, yeah. As this follicle is developing, estrogen is being pumped out. Eventually, that estrogen causes gonadotropin-releasing hormone to be released. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone causes LH to be released. LH then travels to the follicle, and that stimulates the follicle to flush out the oocyte, i.e. ovulation. So, alright, remember this follicle, even though it's been, and has matured the oocyte, it's seemingly useless at this point. However, it's not, because this follicle here, this is what's going to become the corpus luteum. Again, the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is what's going to pump out the progesterone. Now, some of the arteries that we see, we've talked about, the last couple of slides, how, the endometrial wall thickens and then it's sustained. Well, yeah, none of that can happen unless there's a substantial amount of blood vessels, and there is, right? You can see. Some of these layers we looked at before, right? The parametrium, the myometrium, right? The uterine cavity, right? The kind of the open part in through here. But these arteries here, right? The radial artery, which goes and penetrates the myometrium, or the uterine muscle. We can see some of these smaller arteries, right? This spiral arteriole, for instance, right in through here, actually penetrates in through the thickness of the wall of the endometrium. You can see something called the endometrial gland. They start to form and they start to become very pronounced. There's two layers of the uterus, stratum functionalis and stratum bacillus. The stratum bacillus, that is the quote-unquote the basement layer. Right? The stratum functionalis, that is the layer which is created as the uterine wall thickens. Right, so if that doesn't make sense, don't worry. We're going to look at a picture here in a second, and I think it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So here, right, on this left side, right, this is early on, 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that. Right? earlier on in the ovarian and uterine cycle. Pay attention to the stratum functionalis. That goes from here to approximately here. When we look over here, now we can see the stratum functionalis has, I don't even know, it's tripled in size. Right? It's the stratum functionalis which is going to thicken as the uterine cycle continues. Right? This is the layer which Junior would implant into, not the stratum bacillus. Right? The stratum bacillus, let me read these lines here. The stratum bacillus, this is the layer which divides. Right? So let's just draw some cells here. Cool. As this layer divides, well, it divides and it gives rise to another layer. Cool. So this layer will move outwards. Moves outwards. As it divides again, this layer moves outwards further. And you can just envision how if you keep adding more and more layers, they just keep pushing further out, further out, further out. Right? So that's where you see the thickness go, in the matter of a week, almost triple. Right? The numbers I'm throwing out are completely arbitrary, but you see in this image where it's, the stratum functionalis is 2 inches thick, and then here it is almost 6 inches in thickness. Right? Because it's the stratum functionalis which is thickening. And then down here, right, all in through here, that's just all myometrium, just uterine muscle. You can see that down here, very kind of isolated, or much smaller comparatively. And that's because the wall of the uterus is predominantly made up of by the stratum functionalis. And this image on the right, that's right around 3-ish or so weeks. Right, 3-ish or so weeks as far as the menstrual cycle. Just another image. You can see. Would we say, looking at this, that's stratum functionalis. Here's the endometrial gland. Here's the stratum bacillus. Would we say this is somewhat early, late? When would you say this? I'm sorry. When would you say this is? Early. Week. Couple days. Look how thin this is. It's not even the length of the endometrial gland. The stratum bacillus is substantially thicker. So this is definitely someone who's earlier on in their menstrual cycle. Like I mentioned, within a week perhaps. They're definitely earlier on, and you can tell that by the thickness of the endometrial wall. Alright. Sorry, kind of just segueing into that. So some of the kind of external structures. Right, so we've talked about many of the internal structures, from the uterus, right, to the, last week, the vagina, right, talking about the cervix. Here are some of the external structures that we are going to take a look at. So here we can see, right, the external, right, this orifice here, that's the external urethral orifice. That dealt with the urinary bladder, right, how we actually urinated, right here. Just posterior to that, again, the vaginal orifice, right, the vaginal orifice. Now, to the side of that, we see these folds here, right, as well as here. These are called the labia minora. the labia minora. And then to the side of that, larger folds here and here, right, are the labia majora. Right, so we have these folds. Now, as I had mentioned, I don't expect you guys to know for the exam, which one's synonymous with males and females. But the labia majora and the labia minora, whereas in males, right, we have the scrotum, right, that sac which contains the testes. That's synonymous, or that's essentially what develops instead of the labia majora and labia minora in females. Right, in females, the scrotum develops into the labia majora and minora, and vice versa. Same idea with the clitoris. Right, the clitoris, right, that's the female equivalent to the penis in males. You can see its location right here. Just like men, how there was the prepuce of the foreskin, right, colloquially called, there's also the same thing for females, right, the prepuce of the clitoris, or the foreskin of the clitoris, and that's right here. So a histologic view of the vagina itself, once we kind of enter into, right, the vagina here, this is what we see. Really, in large part, we see a tremendous muscularis component, right, from here, essentially all the way down to about here. Right, a substantial degree of muscle movement, right, that we see through the vagina. There's different layers: inner layer, outer layer, longitudinal, circular layer. Right, but something else that we see: non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Yeah, one of the ways to best kind of benefit or to mitigate and prevent any sort of pathogen, think about our skin. Our skin is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Some spots keratinized, other spots non-keratinized. Again, I'm not equating the vagina to skin, but they do line, the skin lines the external part of the body, and again, the vagina is external part of the body as well, right? It's internal, however, it has a direct opening to the external environment, right? So it needs to have some of the same properties that our skin would have, hence the reason why you see it have non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And again here, just a little bit closer, up close and personal view of what it looks like. Alright. Here are some of the deeper muscles. Right? We talk about like the muscles of the perineum, right? Women, even men, but women especially, like post-childbirth, or women who are trying to strengthen the muscles of the undercarriage, for instance, especially women who have like urinary issues post-pregnancy, right? That's unbelievably common. Right? Junior grows to massive size, and it puts a tremendous amount of stress on the bladder. So one of the long-standing problems that pregnant women often have, well, actually, women who were pregnant previously, that they have after birth is stress incontinence, right? Like my mother-in-law. I love to make her laugh, right? Because when I do, she oftentimes kind of pees a little bit, or if she sneezes, or if she coughs, right? When we do those sorts of things, we increase the intra-abdominal pressure, right? When we sneeze, we increase the intra-abdominal pressure to such an extent that we sneeze forcefully out of our nose. Well, one of the other things that we do is we tense up the sphincters to not allow any sort of urine to come out of the bladder. With stress incontinence, those muscles haven't recovered enough, and it can't overtake the force, right? Or it can't withstand the force. All right. So a couple other things that we see. All right, pubic symphysis. Right. This this is a part of the skeletal system. Right. Clitoris we just looked at. External urethral orifice. Again, that was the part of the urinary system. Bulb of the vestibule. Right. To the sides of the vaginal orifice. This is. Think of this as kind of being like the corpora cavernosa or corpus spongiosum of the male. Right. In males, upon erection, right, that's because the corpora cavernosa and the corpus spongiosum filled with blood, they engorged with blood, they swelled, and an erection occurred. Vestibule is kind of the same thing, right? With intercourse, sexual activity, whatever happens to be, the vestibule actually engorges with blood and it swells. Bartholin's gland or greater vestibular gland. And this is going to begin to produce various secretions, right? Lubrication to help lubricate the vaginal opening, vaginal orifice. But these muscles in through here, right? I mentioned talk about these a little bit more so, right? These different glands in through here. We see urogenital triangle. Yeah, these are part of the muscles which are partly responsible for urination, defecation. Right? They don't produce a huge amount of force, but they help to kind of regulate the movement. These are part of the muscles which women work on when they perform, like, for instance, Kegels. Right? Kegels help to strengthen a number of the muscles, the vagina itself, the vaginal opening, but as well as the muscles of the perineum or the undercarriage. And again, one of the end results is hopefully to help improve some of that stress incontinence. It's done for a few other reasons, but that's one of the reasons why. So looking at some other aspects of the reproductive system. When we look at the breast, that's part of what we start to see, right? If we're developing the oocyte, so therefore we can implant the blastocyst. Well, on the back end, there's got to be some way for Junior to eat or Junior to feed, right? That is breast tissue, right? That is the purpose of the breast. And you can see a number of the different structures, from the mammary ducts to the lactiferous sinus, the lactiferous duct, nipple areola. For some reason I just got transported to Philly and I put an R on the end of that when there shouldn't have been one. Right? So areola, not areolar. Right? But some things we can see, right? Lobule containing alveoli. Right? These alveoli, right? Within these different structures, this is where the milk is actually going to be produced. Right? What are called lactiferous glands inside, that are within. They are going to actually produce the milk. And you can see the tubule, the mammary duct, the lactiferous sinus. These are essentially the ductwork, right? Just like the urethra carry the urine from the bladder to the outside part of the body, right? Within the alveoli, these lactiferous glands produce the milk, and then the tubule, along with the mammary duct, along with the lactiferous sinus, along with the lactiferous duct, that's what carries that milk to the surface, right, to the nipple. Therefore, Junior can latch on, and everything's right in the world, right? This is part of the reason why, for instance, one of the much more common nowadays, well, excuse me, I don't know if I'd say it's much more common nowadays. It's common, it's always been common. What used to be a 4-second procedure in a hospital has now become this ridiculously overpriced plastic surgery procedure, right? The underside of the tongue, right, in a child who is tongue-tied, right? What that means is they have, because of the shortness of the frenulum on the underside of the tongue, they're not able to stick their tongue out far enough to get a good latch, right? So what that means, if Junior can't stick his tongue out, him or her can't stick their tongue out far enough, right? The tongue generally kind of, right, comes down this far. Let's imagine that's the tongue. Top lip comes here, and when it happens, Junior kind of draws the tongue backwards, which then pulls the milk out of the nipple. When Junior's tongue-tied, right, that can't happen because they can't get the tongue out far enough. So that frenulum, look into a mirror, lift your tongue up. There's this little thin flap of skin. Right. Back in the day, used to pediatrician would crush it with a pair of pliers, which you're like, that sounds horrible. Not really. It's not really painful at all. And snip the scissors, and literally 4 seconds, it's done. Now it's like, made into a big production, laser and stuff like that. It's obnoxious. Anyways, right here, right as the milk comes out, now the hormone which is responsible for this, right, prolactin's the hormone which is responsible for the production of that milk. Oxytocin is the hormone which is responsible for the ejection of that milk. All right, so just like oxytocin was responsible for the ejection of Junior from the uterus, right, it's also responsible for the ejection of milk from the mammary gland, right, from the breast. This is very much like a reflexive thing, right? If you have ever, whether you have heard of stories of people who have women who recently had a baby, go to the store, and it doesn't matter if it's their baby or not that cries, all of a sudden they begin lactating, right? You're like, damn it, I've got milk, just saturating my shirt. Well, yeah, if there's a baby crying around you, right, you yourself may know, that's not mine. But as far as all the maternal and innate instincts you have, they don't know. They just hear a baby crying. So therefore, that's where it stimulates the production of oxytocin. Oxytocin is released, and then oxytocin then travels to the mammary gland to cause the ejection of milk. So this is kind of just an overview of the cycle. I'm not going to belabor it. I already covered it numerous times, so I'm not going to look at it again, but this is just an overview of the hormones if you want to look at them. Same thing here, right? It's just kind of a chart which has all of the different corresponding levels and structures, right, from the follicle to the thickness of the uterine wall to the release of the particular hormones. So just another image if you're interested in looking at it. All right. So the big thing that we're going to kind of do or kind of focus on for really the remainder of class, when we look at what's going to be on next week's exam, right, we have basically two systems, the urinary system as well as the reproductive system. Now, as I mentioned, I generally don't talk about this much function, right, in the lab. However, not having the models, right, having a challenges of trying to figure out, what to utilize interactively, right? Obviously, with minimal, prep time, minimal options as far as what to utilize, right? Because of the time crunch. In order to kind of help you retain some of that anatomy, right? I definitely focused or talked more so about the physiology or the function. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint in just a minute where we are going to look at the PowerPoints that you guys have and what particular slides that you are that I want you to look at and focus on for the exam next week. Right? I was going to type it up and put it on the announcements page, but it would take me about 10 minutes to announce that. So I'm just going to show you, right, what it is that I'm actually talking about. here is what I was talking about. Right, when I pull up these PowerPoints here, like this one over here, or this one on the right, this is the one that's on D2L already. Right, this is the one that I had posted last week. This is the one that I had gone through. It's all on there. Right. The one on the left, right, this one here, you can see, oh, it's literally the exact slide. However, I've just gone through and I've stripped off the actual names of them. So when you look at this, and when you're trying to figure out, well, what should I study, what images is he going to use, like, as I go through this, you'll see, like, all these different labels, like, they have different names, they have different structures. Same idea. Here's just a gross cadaveric model, but you're able to go through and line up and kind of almost study, quiz yourself, and study from that way. These are literally these are the images I will be utilizing. Same thing as I go through. Right, I'm not going to keep flipping through this one. All these images correspond. Right. So as you go through, you'll see all the labels have been removed. So identify it. Right. If you want to double check, go to that slide and see if you were correct. If you had written, epididymis, if you'd written spermatic cord, right, you can double check yourself. Now, I'm going to flip through here a little bit faster. So, for instance, no images will be utilized for the examination, meaning, like, no images or any sort of image on this particular slide will be utilized for the exam. Right? I won't take anything from this exam or from this image. Right? I won't take this image and use it on the exam. I won't do it. Same thing with this one here. Here, all right, be able to identify all these things it's pointing to. All right, so the ureter, okay, the prostate, okay, the prostatic urethra, right? Up here, the membranous urethra. And if you're like, I'm not really sure what he wants to know, literally flip to the exact. You have the exact slide here, right? So you'll know exactly what it is that I'm asking for, because you have this exact image. And that's the thing. Remember, it is an open book exam. Right? Am I saying that? I'm not saying, don't study and just look up everything. No, you won't have the ability to look up everything. You just don't have that much time. However, absolutely, will you have time to look up a couple? Without a doubt. If you're completely unorganized, no, you probably won't. But if you are organized and have whatever, male reproductive system, accessory glands in kind of, in one pile, and then, primary organs in one pile. If you have female reproductive, organs separated out by, uterus, fallopian tube, and ovaries, and then have it separated out by, you can have it devised and divided and separated any way that you want to organize it. But again, it's an open book format for a reason. Use it to your advantage. All right. But again, you have this exact image, and the same thing of this will be on of the urinary system as well. Right. They'll be within the PowerPoint section. I think they'll just be labeled reproductive system stripped, meaning it'll be stripped of the labels. And again, these are the exact images I will be utilizing for the exam. Right, so there's no questions, concerns. I don't recognize this image. You have the image. You have literally the exact. I'm handing you the answer sheet, if you will. Right, so you'll know exactly what's on it. So again, if you guys have any questions, please reach out. Again, thank you to the number of you who have been reaching out. Right, a couple of you I haven't heard from in a few weeks now. Right, so if you have questions, please reach out. All right, take care.